Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's webinar under the banner One on Education. A very warm welcome to all of you. I am Sujata Gopalan, Assistant Publisher, Orient BlackSwan. We are delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Richard Andrew, an Australian education consultant with over 20 years of teaching and department head experience. He has been delivering teacher professional development primarily to mathematics teachers for 15 years and self-paced online professional development for 12 years. Richard Andrew is the owner and CEO of Learn, Implement, Share. In this session, Richard Andrew will talk about why a highly structured, student-centered approach is key to success in the maths classroom. He will also share some student-centered activities to implement with your students. Thank you, Mr. Andrew, for so readily accepting our invitation to speak. And over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Sujatha. I will share my screen so everyone can see this PowerPoint when this gets out of the way. And so, yes, as Sujatha said, and thank you for that warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here. I am Australian and I will endeavour to speak slowly. So we are discussing a highly structured, student-centered approach to teaching mathematics, the what, the how, and the why. So, as Sujatha said, I'm an Aussie, hail from Australia. I had 20 odd years of teaching experience. I was a maths head of department for 6 years, and I've been a consultant since 2007. And I run professional development courses, mostly online these days. And in 2022, we're excited to announce that I'll be working with Orient BlackSwan to create some short self-paced online courses for Indian teachers. They're going to be really good and they will be based on similar themes to what I'm covering today. So have a look out for those. The burning question that has driven me for 25 to 30 years is, how can I present mathematics so that students truly understand and take ownership over their learning? And this is the area that I work with teachers today, looking at how to present maths so that students truly understand and take ownership over their learning. And that's something we're going to be talking about today. So you might think, well, I'm an Australian and I probably know very little about India, but 3 decades ago, I took this photo in Chennai, which back then was called Madras, in a shop. I had a couple of months traveling through South India, absolutely loved it. This is Mahabalipuram. On the right here is where I rented for a little while, and this was my host. And I was having, this is the first day, I had authentic South Indian food on the floor. It's fantastic. You see, we have Indian food in the West, but it's not Indian food. It's not like the food you get in India, and I haven't had Indian food for 30 years, so I'm missing it badly. And then somewhere between Mahabalipuram and Kerala, I stopped at a place, I can't remember where it was now, but I went to this temple and I witnessed what is possibly the most exciting music I've ever seen in my entire life. And I had no idea that this was going to happen on this particular day. So I have had some Indian experience. I love India and I hope to go back there one day. Back to the workshop. So with the workshop logistics, so obviously there's no discussion back and forth with audio. we will have 15 minutes at least at the end for questions, but we will have a couple of activities. Sometimes I'll have something to think about for you to think about, and I'll either ask you to scribble something, jot something down for 30 seconds, or just to get you to think about something before I talk about it. So that's a little way that we can have some sort of interactivity. So I look out for those scribbling activities and thinking activities. Now I only have 75 minutes to talk and then 15 minutes of questions. So there's not really enough time to dive deep into these ideas about student-centered learning. So this is scratching the surface. We can barely scratch the surface. So this is you could call this a teaser or an introduction. And as I mentioned, myself and OBS, Orient BlackSwan, are going to be creating some continuous professional development online courses for maths teachers. 6 short courses are planned. They'll be self-paced online courses. They'll be short, and there'll be the opportunity to implement ideas during the course. And this is the style of PD that I run through Learn, Implement, Share. The implementations are key. If you want to change your classroom practice, the way to do it is to learn some things and to implement it with your students while you're learning. So that's what we'll be encouraging you to do. Should you choose this next year when we've got some of these courses available. So have a look out for those. I've just mentioned that. So if we talk about this webinar, let's have a look at the overview, but I'm going to do this backwards. So we're going to work backwards with the overview. So the last thing I want to do today is to give you some ideas and activities about student-centered learning. So that's the last thing. But before I give you ideas and activities, we need to deal with one issue that is caused by student-centered learning. And we'll talk about that later. Before we get to that, we need to ask the question, why should we bother with student-centered learning? Why? We need to answer that question. And before we get there, we need to deal with some misconceptions around student-centered learning. So there are a lot of teachers who have ideas about student-centered learning which are not accurate, and we call those misconceptions. So we need to deal with those. And before we deal with the misconceptions, we need to ask ourselves, what do we want as maths teachers? When we are teaching in front of the class, what is it that we actually want? So that's the overview worked backwards. And the last thing we're going to do, as I said, is give you some ideas that you can use. So let's get into this. So the first question, as mathematics teachers, what do we want? And so this is the first thinking activity. I want you to think, or you can jot down if you want to, but I want you to think of 3 things that you want from your math students when you are teaching them. So I'll give you like 15 seconds. So what are 3 things that you want when you're teaching mathematics to your students? Three, 2, 1. All right. This is what most teachers say for this question. Most teachers will say they want their students to be successful. They want their students to be engaged. They want their students to love mathematics. They want their students to be happy, and they want their students to be responsible learners. And all of these things could be summarized by one word: agency. So what we're really saying Now, I'm assuming that most of you will agree with this. I'm just saying that this is what most teachers answer to this question. What do we want for our students? That's what most teachers agree with. And for people who want this, what we're really saying is we want our students to have agency. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this word, but it's a really good concept. And agency, when students have agency, they feel empowered with mathematics. They feel like they have some control over their learning. This is a really important thing. They feel like they have some control over their learning of mathematics and that they're enjoying the process of learning. And importantly, when students have agency, they are taking ownership over their learning, or they're taking responsibility over their learning. So when I talk about student agency, that's what I'm talking about. They're empowered, they feel like they have some control, and they are responsible. They're taking some ownership. Here's a little description. Students have a sense of agency when they feel in control of their learning, when they feel they can influence their learning. Students need to be active participants in their learning. And this term, active participants, one way of looking at it, or the inverse way of looking at it, is it's not always telling students what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. This is how I started teaching. I was very teacher directed. I told all my students what to do, when to do it, how to do it. And because I was always doing that, my students were not active participants. And I got very frustrated, and I just had to find a better way. And I'm not on my own here. So this is what we shouldn't be doing all the time. And so we're looking at changing this. So how can we make our students active participants? How can we give them agency? Here's our first scribbling activity. So I'll give you about 40 seconds for this. I want you to make two lists. One where there's one about no agency and one with agency. So what I want you to do is list what it's like to teach students who have zero agency. So think of the worst class you've ever had. What were the characteristics of teaching that class? What was it like to teach that class? What were the students like? And then on the other side of your paper or whatever you're writing on, think of your best ever class, the students with high agency, who were responsible, who were engaged. What was it like to teach those students? So we're going to have two lists: teaching students with no agency, teaching students with high agency. 40 seconds. Enjoy. Probably about 10 seconds to go. So you should have two lists: characteristics of teaching students with zero agency, characteristics of teaching students with high agency. And this is what most teachers that I work with agree with. So students, when we're teaching students without agency, they're disengaged, oppositional. But when we're teaching students with agency, they tend to be engaged. We're on the same team, right? I'm the teacher, they're the students, but we're on the same team. We're not in opposition. So over here, without agency, lack conceptual understanding. They don't tend to get it. They don't understand the maths. Whereas agency students understand conceptually what's going on. They can explain it to others. Where students don't have agency, it's us, the teachers, we are taking responsibility for the students' learning. But when the students have agency, they tend to be responsible learners. Over here, there's a lot of I hate maths. Over here, there's a lot of I love maths. Without agency, there's little reward. Like, we work really hard, but we don't get much reward as teachers. Whereas when our kids have agency, when our students have agency, there's much greater reward for effort. So over here, lots of student management and little real teaching that goes on. Where the students have agency, little student management needed, but lots of great teaching. This is a lose-lose situation. This is a win-win situation. So these are drastically different scenarios. And the only difference is these students don't have agency and these students do have agency. And so my summary there is that student agency is really, really important. And often teachers don't really think about this. Teachers are too busy. And if you haven't thought about this, I think it's time to think about it. So I argue that student agency ought to be our number one aim. So as a teacher, my number one aim, yes, I'm a maths teacher. Yes, I want to teach maths, but my number one aim is to have kids with agency. So they're responsible learners, they're understanding what they're doing, and they understand, and they're on my page. Once I get that, then we can do some really effective teaching. That's my view. You don't have to agree with me, but that's simply because these two lists are pretty self-explanatory. We don't want this situation. We absolutely want this situation with agency. All right. So this webinar, though, is about student-centric learning. What does student-centric learning have to do with agency? So I've been talking about agency, but what does student-centric learning have to do with this? Or another way to look at this is, how will student-centric learning help me teach mathematics to my students? If I use student-centric learning, how is that going to help me? How will it help my students? These are the questions we need to be asking. So stay tuned, because we need to cover a few things before we get to the student-centric bit. Let's first look at mathematical understanding. How important would you say mathematical understanding is? When you're teaching students, how important? This might sound like a silly question to ask, but it's important. How important is it that our students understand the maths? Or is it possible for them just to learn procedures and not really understand it? So I want you to think about this. This is another thinking activity. Give it a score, the importance of understanding. Give it a score out of 5. Do you think it's a 5? Do you think it's a 4, a 3, a 2, a 1, or a 0? Most teachers will give it a 5. That understanding is really, really important. In the same way that agency is really important, so is understanding. I don't think we'll have many people disagree. So understanding is super important. However, I say, and I've written some articles about this, I say that too many students spend too much time in too many lessons, not really understanding the maths that we set them to do. And I'm not criticizing teachers. I'm just saying that this is a situation, and I haven't been in Indian schools, but I've been in probably 200 school classrooms, maths classrooms in Australia. And from what I've read, I think this is fairly typical in most countries, that there's a lot of students who don't really understand what they're doing in class. Now, I think this is a real issue. When I reflect on my schooling, there were 3 lessons in year 11 when I had no idea what was going on. I didn't understand the maths. 3 lessons in year 11, and I didn't like mathematics. And I wonder, what's it like for students who sit in a lot of lessons not really understanding the work that they're copying from the board and trying to work through? I think it's not good. And as a maths teacher, it's difficult to relate to students who spend a lot of time in a lot of lessons not understanding the maths, because we maths teachers did understand the maths at school, and it's difficult for us to relate. Anyway, the summary here is that understanding is super important, yet I think there's too many students who spend too much time in too many lessons not understanding the maths that we set them to do. So here's a question. This relates to this last slide, okay? If we teach a student how to do one of these questions, like calculate a percentage of an amount, we teach the procedure, whatever you want to, whatever that is, and then the student answers this question. They get their calculator out, they answer this question, they answer the 3rd one, the 4th one, the 5th one, the 6th one, and they get 5 out of 6 correct. How many of us just assume that this student understands what they're doing? My point is, because I used to, I just assumed if I had students getting the correct answers, then they were fine. The problem is, it's possible to copy down what the teacher's written and to replicate the example, but not understand what they're doing. So I'm proposing that mathematical understanding is 2 things. Yes, it's an understanding of the procedure. So if we teach a procedure, there's part of mathematical understanding is understanding how that procedure works, working it through. But I suggest that a more important aspect to understanding is that students have an understanding of the concept upon which the procedure is based. If we can have students understand the concepts, they don't even really need the procedure. The procedure is still important, but they can still work things through. But if students don't have an understanding of the concepts upon which the procedures are based, it's very, very difficult to remember the procedures. So this is related to what we're talking about today, the student-centered learning. However, and I didn't I didn't want to not mention understanding because it's so important. The problem is we've only got 90 minutes and that's not enough time to cover mathematical understanding. So once again, look out for these continuous PD short online courses that are coming, because one of them is going to be tackling this mathematical understanding to a fairly deep level and giving activities that you can explore. So I needed to mention mathematical understanding, but we don't have enough time to go through it. And so look out for the online courses. All right. So that's all we can cover with the understanding. You will see that the student-centered approach will help understanding, but we'll come to that later. So let's look at student-centric learning. And I've picked some photos that are based on Indian schools. And I'll talk a little bit about the photos. So it's hard to know exactly the type of teaching that's going on here, but this is not a lecture situation. Now, I know these are probably primary students, but this speaks to me of something that's somewhat student-centric. And the first thing I want you to think about, so this is another thinking activity, so I'll give you 20 seconds. When you hear the term student-centric learning or student-centered learning, do you have any negatives that come to mind? Do you think of things that you think, well, Richard, it's all sounds good, but there are problems? Do you think student-centric learning is problematic? Are there negatives? Or do you hear other people talk about student-centric learning in a negative way? I just want you to think about some things that are problematic or that are negative about student-centered learning. Just have a think about that for 10 seconds. So any negatives, anything that you think, well, it's a problem. Here's what most maths teachers say are negative, or teachers who are keen on student-centered learning now, but used to think these negatives. Here we go. These are common. So a lot of people say the problem with student-centric learning is it lacks structure. It's difficult to manage. It takes too much time. The students have fun, but they don't learn much. There's no explicit instruction, or there's no opportunity for explicit instruction. And we all know that explicit instruction is important. And the teacher lacks control over the learning. So these are the common negatives that teachers say that either they or other teachers think about student-centered learning. However, all of these are misconceptions. All of these are incorrect if you do student-centered learning correctly. And I talk about highly structured student-centered learning. So student-centric learning can lack structure, and it can be difficult to manage, and it can take too much time. But what I'm saying is if we do it properly, none of these things apply. And this is why that we suggest, or I suggest, that you use student-centric learning that is time efficient, is highly structured, is conceptually based, allows for explicit instruction, has lots of teacher input. You'll find yourself extremely busy, has the teacher listening more than the usual lecture style, and caters for a wide spread of students. So this is when I'm talking about student-centric learning, I'm talking about an approach that does all of these things. It's time efficient, highly structured, conceptually based, explicit instruction, lots of teacher input, more able to listen to the students, and it also caters for a wide spread of students. I'll mention this because when we use our normal, let me start this. When I was taught with a teacher-centered approach. The teacher taught everything, and I listened and I copied. That was how I was taught as a student, and that's how I started to teach, and that's still how most mathematics is taught across the world today, mostly. When we turn that around and when we start using a more student-centric approach, we're not holding the faster students back, and we're not speeding up the slower ones. We allow them to spread out through a unit of work. This is when we use this student-centric approach for a whole unit of work. What happens is the spread of students increases. So we need to be able to cater for that, and we'll talk about that later. In the notes that I've prepared for you, there is a video from Belinda Nowak, who completed 2 of my courses, and I interviewed her. And between the 20 minutes and 22:40, Belinda talks about how the student-centered approach was time efficient. It didn't take any more time. In fact, I think it actually saves time. But Belinda's explanation of that is really good, so you can check that out. But the link is in the notes. So the one issue that student-centered learning creates, and I've already touched on it, is that it creates a wider spread of students through a unit of work. So, and as I said, we'll deal with that later. Question: what does highly structured student-centric learning look like? Like, what does it look like in action? So here's that photo again. So students are more curious and they use their own thinking. So you structure an activity, it's well scaffolded, it's well structured, but the students, because they have more control over what they're doing, it raises their curiosity. They tend to use their own thinking. That's the whole point. Because they're using their own thinking, they're more curious. As you can see, these kids look very engaged. Student collaboration and teamwork often happens. Now, this guy here may be the teacher or he may be a student. I think he is the teacher, but you can see that these students are working in a team or in a group. So that means it's more student-centered. There's intrinsic engagement in the collaboration. Now, it doesn't have to, these are just photos that I found that looked like they fitted with the student-centric theme. So student-centric learning can look quite different. It can be different things, but you should get a picture though from these images. Here, students are working independently from the teacher. And you can see that here. This is agency, right? They're not reliant on the teacher telling them what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. There's lots of teacher input. Here's the teacher here. Now, this might not be mathematics, but again, we've got a group and the teacher has chosen to give some input. This is explicit instruction. So some teachers think that because explicit instruction is important, it has to be through a lecture, but it doesn't have to be through a whole class lecture. It can be, some of the best explicit instruction can be to small groups. I love this photo. This photo says so much. But the teacher is free to work with students who require the most help. And again, this is explicit instruction. So all these images are different from the lecture format. However, there are no absolutes. This is not about only using student-centric approaches. I am not suggesting that teachers should only ever use student-centric approaches. And I'm not also suggesting that we should never use teacher-centric approaches, because this is a continuum. There's a continuum between teacher centricity and student centricity. All right. And what we're aiming for, you can sort of think about, well, where are you? Maybe you do some student-centric learning, or maybe you haven't. But what I'm suggesting is that we aim just to head a little bit more in this direction. If you are fully teacher-centric, let's try something that's more student-centric. And I'll give you some ideas soon. There are simple things we can do. So we're aiming to head a little bit in this direction. If you're already here, well, then you could just find some more student-centric activities that you can do, or maybe you make them more structured or find ways to give more input. But we're just aiming for more student centricity, but it's not an absolute, it's a continuum. We still need teacher-centric teaching, but we definitely need student-centric teaching. I think across the globe, and I'm assuming that India is part of this, there is way too much emphasis on teacher centricity and not enough emphasis on student centricity. So I'm suggesting we head in this direction. Thinking spot. All right. So you don't have to write anything down. I'll just give you a few seconds to think about this. And it's a good question to think about. So we're talking about student-centered learning or a student-centered approach. Here's the question. What makes a student-centered approach student-centered? What is it? Or what can we add to an activity to make it student-centered? What is it that makes an activity student-centered? So have a think. It's one word. Have a think. Here we go. The grand reveal. Here it is. 3, 2, 1. It's choice. We simply, apologies for the car, I've got the window slightly open. We simply add choice. Choice is the thing that makes a student-centered approach student-centric. Choice is the thing that we add to an activity to make it student-centered. It is that easy. And the more choice I'll explain this over the next few slides, but the more choice we provide, the more student-centered the activity becomes, and the greater the opportunity for agency. Now, just because we use a student-centered approach doesn't mean that our students are going to have agency. But what it does is it opens the door for them to take some responsibility for their learning. We have to open the door, and the way to open the door for students to have agency is to add some choice to make the activity more student-centered. But we need to be wise, because too much choice can create failure. And I've made this mistake, especially when I was first exploring this area. You get excited and you offer kids too much choice and not enough structure, and it's a complete failure. So you just have to be, it takes a little while to work out what's the correct mix. But yeah, So you don't want too much choice. What you do need is structure. So you've got to have, the activities have to be structured. Students need to have direction, like how to start, what to do next, within the student-centered activity. Now, here are some things about choice. Because choice is pretty incredible because it's so simple to add. We add choice to foster agency. How to explain this? If I'm telling students, like I used to, if I'm telling students step by step, everything they have to do, when to do it, how to do it, when to stop doing it, if that's what I'm doing, which is full teacher directed, and this is how I used to teach, I taught students step by step everything they needed to know. If that's what I'm doing, then there's no opportunity for them to take responsibility. There's no opportunity for students to feel like they have some control over their learning, because I am taking responsibility for their learning. So if I want them to have agency, which means I want them to have some control over their learning, I need to move away from this towards something that's more student-centric, that gives them more choice. I hope that makes sense. When we add choice, we foster responsibility in students for the same kind of reason. Responsibility comes through making decisions. That's what responsibility is. You give students some responsibility, some choice. They have to make decisions. They could make the wrong decision. They could make the decision to not bother doing any work, or they can make the decision to do a lot of work. That's responsibility. They're taking responsibility. They might make a mistake early, but they're going to learn it. But if we don't give them the opportunity to make decisions, then they can't get responsibility. So by adding choice, we foster responsibility. When we add choice, it increases engagement. Now, this is an amazing thing. The easiest way to improve your engagement in class is just to add some choice. I think a lot of teachers don't realize this. It is the easiest way to engage your students. Don't go overboard, but every time you add some choice, you increase the engagement. Try it. It's amazing. And fourth and last thing, by adding choice, it makes an activity student-centered. It's the choice. See, if I go back to my old example, if I'm telling the students step by step everything they need to know, how to do it, what to do, when to do it, if that's what I'm doing, there's no choice there. It's teacher-centered. But if I start to give them some freedom and have an activity where they can think their own way through and make decisions, that's what student-centered is. So by adding choice, we make it an activity student-centric. So there's a few interesting things about choice, which is an amazing facet of education. All right, here's a jotting activity. 40 seconds. I want you to think actually, I might give you a minute for this. I really want you to think hard about this, because some of you will know exactly what to say and others of you might struggle to think of things. We've talked about choice, we've talked about student-centric learning, but specifically with choice, what are some ways that we could give students choice within a maths unit or within a maths activity? What are some ways that you could give choice to your students? I'm hoping what I've said so far has given you some ideas, but I'd like you to jot down maybe 45 seconds, jot down some points, because what I'm going to do next is give you some examples, and it'll be interesting for you to compare my examples with what your ideas are. So 45 seconds, jot down, what are some ways that you could give students choice? Actually, I'm going to call this short because I'm running a little bit behind time, which is not surprising. So I'm not going to have a list of things that people say, because people could say 100 different things. So that was just I wanted you to be thinking before I gave you some ideas. So what's following now are some simple ideas that add choice and make an activity student-centered. Now, the first idea is super, super, super simple. And I call it the progress choice through banks of questions. So this is a very simple student-centered activity. Most teachers, to some level, state to students the exact questions they have to do, or they give a lot of guidance. So, for example, and this is what I used to do when I first, for a lot of years, I would use a text and I would write on the board the questions that I wanted the students to do. Page 149, question 2, ACE, question 3, B, D, F, and G, question 4, blah, blah, blah. And I'd write it down. And some teachers aren't quite as explicit as that, but that's very teacher-centric. There's no choice there. The kids don't have agency. So why not do this? This is ridiculously simple. Anybody can do this. Give them some guidelines. Give the students some guidelines. So you could say, we're working through chapter 5. Most of the questions have lots of parts to it. What you have to do for each question, answer a minimum of 4 parts per question. And if there's less than 8 parts, then just answer half of the parts. All right, so let's say that question 1's got 20 parts. You have to do 4. Make sure you include some of the harder parts. Mark your own work as you go and ask yourself this question. If you know that you know, then move on to the next question. So as you're working through, you've done the 4 parts. Do I know that I know this? Yes, I do. This is easy. Move on to the next question. But if you think, well, I'm not so sure, do some more practice. Do some more parts. Now, this is so simple. You could have this on a piece of paper. You wouldn't use it all the time, but you could say, right, we're going to use our guidelines for this chapter, or we're going to use these guidelines today, or whatever. But what does this do? Does it offer choice? Yes, it does. Is it student-centered? Yes, it is. Because the students are making some choice about, do I do more parts or do I just do 4? No, I think I need to do more. Some students will cheat the system. And you talk about that. Look, you could take the easy road and not do enough parts. But why would you do that? If they're going to make that mistake, let them. But they need to learn, right? We're going to give them the opportunity. Is it intrinsically engaging? Well, it's more engaging than just telling them exactly everything they have to do. Does it require metacognition? Metacognition means thinking about your thinking or thinking about your learning. Yes, it does, because they're having to ask, do I understand this? That's metacognition. That is a really good quality. That's part of agency. Do they have a sense of control over their learning? Will they have more of a sense of control than if I'm telling them exactly what to do all the time. Does it foster agency? Yes, it does. So that's a really, really simple idea that anybody can adopt. Next one. I love this. If you Google the best ever mathematics extension activity explained, that is an article that I've written, and this explains this whole thing much in more detail. So I think I've added that to the notes. I can't remember, but if you just jot that down, the best ever mathematics extension activity explained, and follow that. This is simply, this came from the fact that I used to make up really good questions and kind of funny, quirky questions. But as I was making them up, I thought, gee, this is really mathematical. To make up a question that works is really mathematical. I should get my students to do this. And so I started using this as an extension activity. So if you have a unit of work and you've got some that is student-centered and some students finish early, they might finish 1 or 2 lessons earlier than the rest. This is the best ever mathematics extension activity. So what they do is they create a substantial worded question. You know that in most texts, there'll be like a paragraph, a question that's a paragraph. It might be on financial mathematics, or it might be on measurement, and there's an area and the farmer and the selling the land or whatever, something that's a bit more complicated. What you guide, the boys in particular, you need to guide, because the boys, or Western boys anyway, will tend to make the hardest possible question known to mankind, and it doesn't work. So find a page and say, hey, look, Amit, see the questions on page 123. I want you to create a question that's around that level of difficulty, because we're going to use it for other students in this class. So you guide them into the level of difficulty and make sure it's a level below what they're capable of. They create their question and they have to create worked solutions. They need to know that it works. And then they create a neat copy of their question and a neat copy of their solution. And then you photocopy them, and then you can use them, add them to your question bank and use them with the other kids. And so you can have Basu's question, Abdul's question, Falak's question, you know, and they do each other's questions, and it is so engaging. But there's so much maths involved in making up a worded question like this. So again, very easy to do. There's no preparation required, but it doesn't have to be an extension activity. You could do this as part of a unit. You could do this with students who struggle with maths and just get them to create some simpler questions, because that will help them to understand conceptually what the maths is about. So you can use it in other situations as well. Does it offer choice? Yes, it does. Is it student-centric? Yes, it is. Is it intrinsically engaging? Absolutely. Does it give students a sense of control over their learning? Well, they're certainly controlling everything about the question that they're making up. Does it foster some agency? Yes, it does. So that's another great, really simple activity that anybody can do, use. Again, this is, if you Google this, the best ever mathematics extension activity explained, you will see that article. Next one. How am I going on for time? A little bit behind. Okay, card matching. This is awesome. This is ideal for topics such as straight line graphing, polygons, statistics, probability. So as you can see here, kids are just matching, the students are just matching cards to make a picture or to make sense. In this situation, we've got graphs, we've got equations, we've got a set of ordered pairs, and we've got a gradient, I think that's the other thing. Students work in pairs. The teacher cannot answer a question directly. If the student asks specifically, what does this go with? You can't answer that. You only answer a question with another question. So I've got a video here with it's cut down with the audio strip because I want to talk over the top of it. And so this is a card matching activity for straight line graphs. This is the teacher who admits she's a very conservative teacher and she struggled with this activity, but she loved it because it was so different to what she normally does. Here are the students getting started, just sorting out the cards, having a look at what they've got, and you can see the level of discussion. This is a summative activity. They've already done the unit, and so this is towards the end of the unit, but you could tell, oh, by the way, the link is in the notes, so you can watch this whole video, but you'll hear some of the discussion, and it's rich discussion. The kids, a lot of these students are learning for the first time how these things go together. So, we've got, so there we're looking at y equals x, and they're explaining to each other why that graph matches that equation and why the point -3 is on that line, and so on and so on. So working in pairs. So you can imagine you could do this with probability. You just need 3 or 4 different types of information. So you get the picture. I'm just going to kind of speed this up here. So here they're looking at 1, 5, and that graph. And at the end, they write a journal article summarizing what they got out of the lesson, and they talk about it. So that's what card matching looks like. It's fantastic. I know I skipped over that really quickly, but there's 2 links to that video. The main link sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Hopefully the second one will work if you get stuck. If the first one doesn't work, check it in a couple of weeks' time. It should be fine. So does it offer choice? Yes, it's student-centered, very engaging, lots of metacognition, lots of control over the learning, and yes, it fosters agency. Next one is the work requirement scheme. Okay, this is also basic, but this is where you want a student-centered approach through a whole unit of work. So it's a lesson by lesson scheme for a unit of work. The progress is maintained regardless of missed lessons. See, I've got lesson 4, lesson 5 rather than dates. The homework is included for each lesson. The teacher checks completed work at the end of a unit. The work requirement scheme can be adjusted on the fly. So that just means that if you can add more questions in or remove questions, and teacher and students become more organized. So I really like this because it got me organized for an entire unit. So I handed this out. It looked a bit like this. This is one example, directed number. This is year 7. So it's some instructions. Lesson 1, there's those exercises. As a class, we do this. Then you do that. Then there's a teaching segment, and then you do that. And then lesson 2, and then lesson 3 is here, lesson 4. So you just do this to suit yourself. And then, so there was only 7 lessons in this one. Your book should be ready to hand in now. So I was using 2 books, and I would keep one. They'd be using one. I'd collect and give them the other book back. I just found this. I actually used this with some classes because when I started at this school, they weren't on my page. So I used this as a management system, really. But let's have a look at. I know I'm going really quick. Again, in the online course version of this, we'll do a deeper dive. There's lots of choice because the students can work faster or slower in a lesson. Sometimes they'll do all of their homework within the lesson. Sometimes they'll do more of everything at home. It's much more student-centered. It is more engaging. It's not wildly engaging, but it is more engaging because students have more of a control over their learning. And yes, it does foster agency. All right, so now we're looking at student spread. So I know I flew through that pretty quickly, but there's a few ideas. Again, the online version will have more ideas. But let's look at how to deal with a student spread. So if we're using a work requirement scheme, you can imagine that students will spread out more in that unit. So how can we deal with a wider student spread? And the solution is many lessons. So, because if students spread out within a unit, you can't use a full class lecture, right? You can't use the full class lecture anywhere near as much because you've got students at different levels. And so the mini lessons are the solution. So you have very few whole class lectures, instead short teaching spots as students require them. Now this could be a mini lesson here, right? It could look like that, or it could look like this. So a mini lesson is repeated for the same information. So you have a few students hit one spot in a unit and need some extra help. So you give that mini lesson. They keep moving, some other students hit that spot, you do the mini lesson again. You might bring them out to the board like this, or there's another photo I'll show later, another system you might use. This is more just-in-time teaching. This is much better than me always saying, righto students, stop, I'm going to tell you the next thing you need to know, because that's me taking responsibility for their learning. The good thing about having students progress at their own pace and then asking you for help is that they are empowered. They are controlling the learning. They are asking you, now, Mr. Andrew, now I'm ready for this next piece of information. So it's just in time teaching. So it's less the teacher saying, stop everyone, let me show you the next thing you need to know. And there's a lot more students asking, sir, how do I do this? It's a big advantage, a big difference. Now, a mini lesson could look like this image here. All right, so this looks like it's a very teacher-centric situation. But if you look at these boys, or I think they're all boys, a few of them are looking at him and a few aren't. So this could be, and this is what my mini lessons used to look like. So I'd be asking, who knows that they understand this? And some students would put their hands up. So they are not in the mini lesson. All right, if you know that you know, keep working. Who knows they need help with this? Because I've just said, look, I'm going to explain this thing. Who knows they need help? Okay, you four watch me. And these could be the four. He seems to be watching, he seems to be watching, he seems to be watching, he seems to be watching. So I would be doing the mini lesson to these four students. You four students watch me, I'll do a mini lesson. The rest of you work on quietly. That's the most common way that mini lessons work. You can bring them to the front, but I found that the most efficient. All right. So students need, so the advantage is that the mini lessons foster metacognition. Students need to continually ask themselves, what do I know? What do I need help with? Do I need to listen to this mini lesson? Will I be part of this mini lesson? And that's a good thing. Again, Belinda, between these two time slots in the same video explains her use of mini lessons. So you can check that out. Now, have I got time for this? Yes, we have got a little bit of time. Okay, I found this today. This is an article called "This Teacher's Classes Last for 3 hours, but the students do not get bored." And look, there's not much more in the article than what I'm showing you here. It's basically a series of, so this teacher, I don't know if you've heard of him. I don't know anything about this teacher, but I looked at the tweets, his Twitter tweets, and I thought, he's talking about exactly what we're talking about. So I'm just sort of, I'm putting his tweets up and I'm giving my perspective on what he's doing. All right, first one, I'll go through this very quickly. There are a few things many schools get wrong. The first thing I ensured is that the students don't feel they are in a typical class. So what I think he's saying is that he's not doing teacher directed. He's not doing step-by-step teaching. All right. Next one, students work around tables. They're not all facing me. They talk amongst each other. Thinking as a team is fine. So this is a student-centered approach. He's fostering agency in his students. So my typical class is noisy. I only address students for a quarter of the class. They are exploring the remaining of the time. Again, exploring and investigations, that's student centricity and agency. He's talking about what we're talking about. The problems they have to think about are usually challenging. Usually a solution takes 20 to 30 minutes of discovery. Discovery means student centricity. If I'm telling students step by step what to do, that's not discovery, right? Discovery has to happen in a student-centric environment, and that produces agency. In the process, they learn patience. They realize problem solving is not some 30-second activity. So it's not, he's not doing step by step. It's much more student-centric with agency. They learn to work in teams. This interaction is what adds to the experience of learning. So teamwork is also student centricity. Interaction breeds understanding and agency. So again, this is about student-centric learning. I'm not usually satisfied with one way of solving. They learn there is usually more than one way to solve a problem. So this is the explicit instruction with some teacher centricity and student centricity. He's obviously workshopping this. And there's also, I see multiple ideas. They see multiple ideas from their peers, which tells them there is no one correct way. So multiple ideas from peers means that there's a student-centric environment. He's workshopping with this, there's collaboration, there's understanding, and again, there's agency. So I know we flew through that really quickly, but that's from this article, so you might want to jot this down. This is not in the notes, but mind you that the article is not much more than what I've shown you there, but you do get access to his Twitter feed. So this is the article. It's this teacher's classes last for 3 hours, but the students do not get bored. So that's what that is. Okay, I've just caught up. That's fantastic. I'll leave that up there for another few seconds. I hope that makes sense. And I found that was really interesting. I thought, wow, this is exactly what we're talking about. So there's no doubt that if we observed his lessons, we would see a student-centric approach in action. Okay, on to the next thing. Let's do the summary. So the summary is, having students with agency is our #1 aim, because agency is about responsibility, it's about understanding, it's about having some control over learning, it's about engagement, right? And I still say that should be our #1 aim. If we haven't got our students responsible, if they're not understanding what's going on, if they're not on our team, then we're not going to be able to teach them anything. So that's why agency should be #1. Understanding is key. Again, we only touched on this. We didn't look into it. Look out for the CPD course, the continuous PD course online, which will talk about understanding. Student-centered activities foster agency. It's just the way it works. If I'm telling students what to do, when to do it, how to do it, step by step, that's teacher-centered. There's no space for agency there. There's no space for them to take ownership, because I'm taking ownership. But if we make it student-centered, if we give them choice, then they have the opportunity to gain agency. Adding choice makes an activity student-centered. We've looked at that. Choice is kind of the same thing as student centricity, or like the two things like that. And choice is also the easiest way to raise engagement. And aiming for highly structured student-centric activities and units of work. That's what we are aiming for. Highly structured student-centric activities and units of work. But remember, it's a continuum. We're just trying to move. Let's add some more highly structured student-centered activities into what we're doing, experiment with it. As we get more confident, we can add more and more. All right, but it doesn't mean that there's no teacher centricity. In fact, some activities are both teacher-centric and student-centric at the same time. And I don't have time to explain and give you an example, but it's true. Some are both at the same time. So we are pretty much on, well, actually I'm a little bit early, but I'd like to, I think that this is the best way to go. So Sujatha, I'm not sure how this works now, but let's take some questions. Sujatha, yeah, so how does this work?
Yes. It was an excellent session, Mr. Andrew.
Oh, thanks.
You have explained in great detail, actually, about how understanding is the key, how student-centered activities foster agency, and last but not the least, the importance of choice to enable student-centered learning. I mean, I'm sure it will help our teachers to enable students to become responsible learners. So we are ready for questions now. Teachers, can you send us your questions, please? Okay, I've got the first one here. So let me start with this. In a country like India, as far as mathematics classroom is concerned, a teacher-centered approach is more popular. We all know, you also mentioned it actually. How do you think we can change this mindset, so that we encourage peer teaching and student-centered teaching? How do you think this is possible?
Well, let me say that in India, you can't own this idea that, most Indian maths teachers teach in a teacher-centric way, because in the West, most maths teachers, as their default, are teacher-centric. So it's not just India. I think the reason why most teachers still teach traditionally is because no one is laying out a roadmap, and so of how to do this. And so people try something that's student-centric and it's unstructured and it takes a whole lesson and nothing happens, and it's difficult to manage, and they just think this is ridiculous. And so they'll go back to what they know. So the question was, how can we encourage teachers? Well, to be honest, to be really honest, do a couple of these courses that are coming up next year, because you will then be able to watch videos and read the pages and read the instructions and try some activities and report back to the course all during the time the course runs. And you could get other team members on your faculty to do the same course at the same time. Maybe you take 2 months to do a 2 or 3 hour course, but when it comes to implementing, maybe you implement 10 times these activities and share with each other what's working and what's not working, and write back to the course, and then we can guide you into doing it well. What's needed is practice. And some of those ideas that I shared were very simple and they're easy to start with. So, don't try and do everything, but just try something first and then share it with your colleagues. But I find these self-paced, comprehensive online courses are really fantastic for that purpose. I know that sounds like I'm marketing, but it's true.
I agree. Can we take the next one?
Yeah.
Given that we have a stipulated syllabus to complete each year, and the fact that student-centered activities take time, what is the best way to strike a balance between the two to promote agency? Could you give us some practical suggestions?
Right. Well, that first activity that I mentioned, and I'm assuming that most teachers direct the students on the questions that they answer. Now, if you were to say to students, okay, we're still going to work through these questions in the way we have, but you're going to take responsibility for how many questions you do and for what questions you do. Just doing that, it's very simple to do that. That's a good start, and you will find that their level of agency will improve, their level of engagement will improve. and it's just a start. The work requirement scheme is something that's the one where you write down lesson by lesson what they're going to do. That's something you might want to try just for a couple of lessons, or you might just try something that's, okay, students, this is what you're doing this lesson. You're going to work in pairs. There are some things to discuss. Just try it. Now, a lot of people say, well, we don't really have time, the student-centered activity takes more time. It can take more time, or it can save you time. And that's why I want you to watch that, whatever that little 4 minutes of video is, and you have the link on your notes. Watch that, because that's Belinda, who's done 2 of my courses and has adopted this approach. And she's doing it on a bottom year 10 class who will refuse to do homework and refuse to revise. They are like your worst students. And she had enormous success. And she talks about the fact that this approach did not take any more time than normal. In fact, she had time that she could do extension work. So again, you just got to start. Like, no one's asking you to change everything you're doing and go student-centered. Just try something and make it structured. Make sure the students know what to do first. But again, there'll be a lot more detail in the continuous PD.
I suppose this is an overlapping question, so I guess the answer will be similar, but I'll anyway tell it out. How can we make the student-centered approach effective in large classrooms?
Right. That's a good question. That is a good question. And I know that Indian classrooms tend to be larger, but I would also suspect that most Indian students are more willing to do the right thing than most Western students. So the larger class size, let's say you are going to do the work requirement scheme, lesson by lesson, handout, and you've got your teaching spots, and students do this, and you mix the activities up, but each lesson they work through their scheme. And so some students will move faster. So you need to do the mini lessons. Well, it's exactly the same as with a class of 30, even though you've got 40 or 45. You just have your mini lessons, instead of being to teams of 3, to groups of 3, that'll be maybe 7 at a time. You can have your students working together. Peer teaching is really important, but make it organic. If the students want to work together, let them work together. It's a really good thing to do, but you just need to let them do that a little bit. And every now and then you'll need to stop them and give them some advice, how to work together better, whatever you need to do. I found, because, that was absolutely didn't take more time, because I've said, right, we've got to get through this unit in 12 lessons. So there it is. And here's the end date. This is what we have to cover. In some ways, it was easier to get through the work on time than for me to be in control of the pace. So just because it's more in the room, I know that's challenging, but it's still doable. It just means that you might be you're talking to 7 or 8 or 10 students at once when you do your mini lesson. The thing with a mini lesson is a mini lesson doesn't take as much time as a whole class lesson. When I used to go, right, everyone stop. I'm the great maths master. I know that you need to get this next piece of information. Well, half the students aren't ready for it anyway. And that's a slower process. Whereas with a mini lesson, I know you have to repeat yourself, but you have to repeat yourself with whole class lectures anyway. With a mini lesson, it tends to be, you can do it in a much shorter time, each one. But again, give it a try. What's the worst thing that can happen? Just try it, try little steps, get a feel for it, discuss it with your peers. And again, check out the the CPD that's coming next year. It's going to be great.
How do we help children, young children, very young children own their learning?
How do we help very young children
to own up their own learning? I mean, how do they
to take responsibility?
Take responsibility, yes.
Are we talking about 5, 6-year-olds maybe?
Yeah, primary level, maximum 8 to 10 years.
Well, if you look at a toddler, like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, they are taking responsibility for their learning. If you watch them learn, they're playing, they're making decisions. It's student-centric, right? We don't teach students how to walk and how to run and how to put blocks together and how to, build a little thing with sticks outside their house or whatever. They work that out. It's student-centric, and they're in control of that process. So I say, why should that change when school comes along? Allow them, give them some challenges, give them a problem, let them explore, let them do exactly what they've been doing for the first 4 or 5 years of their life. And so I think the problem is that in school, we tend to go to this, right, everyone stop, this lecture format, and that's the opposite to what they're used to. So it's just like, let's do less of that lecture format and let them explore. Like that example I gave with all those tweets, it's not, I know this sounds difficult to someone who hasn't done it before, but I'll give this warning. I will warn you, if you head in this direction, you will get addicted. If you do this well, it is so addictive. If I went back in the classroom and someone said to me, Richard, you have to teach traditionally, you have to teach teacher-centered, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it anymore. It's too difficult. Teaching in a more student-centered way, for me, is so much easier, but I'm used to it. So, and it's way more fun to teach this way. You just have to give it a try, take small steps, get some experience, feedback from the kids, see what works, see what doesn't work, keep it structured, and have fun. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
How can we adapt materials for a mixed ability classroom?
Well, I think all classrooms are mixed ability, even if they
true.
are technically not. Well, I think this approach suits a mixed ability classroom even better. I would take the work requirement scheme approach. I would create one scheme and then like on a Word document, and then I would adapt it for a couple of different levels and hand it out, and then let the kids progress at their own pace. The beauty is the students who are more able, they don't require your help so much, and they're working together and they are working ahead. You're freed up to work with the students who need your help more. Whereas before, when you're doing full class lectures, you can't help those. Again, watch that bit, Belinda's interview about the mini lessons. In fact, under that YouTube video, I have time-stamped the whole video. So you can have a look and find other bits that you can watch. But there's the bit on mini lessons that sort of answers that question.
Can blended learning be a solution to student-centered learning? Can blended learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're talking about online learning as a supplement to face-to-face.
Yes,
Absolutely. Yes. And I didn't mention that. But yeah, so if you have, because the good thing with the online aspect to blended learning is you've got a student saying, oh, look, Mr. Andrew, I need help with this. Great, we've got videos on that. Just go to page 13 or 12 or whatever on your portal and watch those 3 videos and then get back to me. Or they might be working through that at their own pace. So that definitely makes it easier because it's more student-centered. Once it's online, you can't make it teacher-directed. They've got more control over the pace that they work, and they might choose to do this and choose to do that.
So finally, we have one last question. How do we motivate children who feel they are not good at mathematics?
Yeah, well, we've got to ask, why do they feel that they're not good at mathematics? And I'm really passionate about this, and I'm not criticizing teachers. I'm just criticizing the approach. But when I was teaching step by step, whole class lecture, I'm telling students what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. That's my default, right? That's what I do mostly. There's a lot of kids who are following what I'm doing on the board and replicating that and sort of doing those, getting the right answers, but they don't understand what they're doing. This is where that understanding section, which I couldn't cover here, is so important. Because when you think about it, we are asking a lot of students to remember hundreds of procedures without them understanding the concepts that they're based on. And that's an impossible task. And that's why we've got so many students who hate maths, because maths is the worst thing. If we don't understand it, if we don't understand it conceptually, it's a nightmare. But when the kids do understand, it makes all the difference. So the kids who have already, I say kids, students who are turned off, we got to look at why they've been turned off. And the way to turn that around is to start teaching conceptually, to start allowing them to use their own thinking and start to get some confidence. And it takes a while, but it won't happen if we keep teaching them in a teacher-centered way. That's my view. It's not necessarily popular with everyone, but I'm sticking to it.
That was the last question for us. So thank you, Mr. Richard Andrew, for a wonderful, wonderful session. I think all the participants would have found it very informative and very useful, along with the question answer session. Looking forward to seeing you again as a presenter on Orient BlackSwan ONE. I would also like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. We would love to hear from you. Please do share your feedback with us. Good day from all of us at Orient BlackSwan.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
So do we stay online here, Sujatha, or should I just leave the meeting?
Thank you so much, Richard. You can leave now. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. Okay. Bye.
Bye, Richard. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.